Hey friends, so in this video I want to talk about Matthew 11 verses 2 through 11, which is the gospel reading for week 3 of Advent in year A of the lectionary. So let's start with just the first couple verses here. You see verse 2 begins with, "Now when John heard in prison about the things the Christ was doing, he sent word by his disciples to Jesus asking, 'Are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another?'" And I think I want to pause right there and sort of expound on John's question. You can see that this passage here begins with mentioning that John is in prison when he heard about the things that the Christ was doing. And I've put over here a nice little painting by Caravaggio of Salome with the head of John the Baptist, because that fact, I think, is really what hangs over this whole passage, right? The fact that John is in prison, I think, has a lot to do with this question that he's asking, right? He sends his disciples to Jesus to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another?" And I think the sort of subtext of that question is John's really questioning, like, wait, is Jesus the one that I thought that he was, right? So if you think back to the passage that we did just last week for week 2 in Advent, we saw John the Baptist announcing Jesus, right? Saying that this one is coming after me, he's stronger than me, and I'm not worthy to untie his sandals and all this stuff, right? And so John is pointing to Jesus as the one who is to come and who will baptize with fire and all of these things, right? And so John has been the forerunner. He's been the voice of the one in the wilderness calling out, "Prepare the way of the Lord," right? Meaning Jesus who is coming. And so, but now we've gotten to chapter 11, and it's more of an open question, right? And why is it an open question? Well, I think the reason is because John's in prison, right? And so I think John's kind of saying here, hey, Jesus, I thought you were the one who was going to deliver Israel, right? You can see right here, I've sort of paraphrased how I'm thinking about John's question here. It's as if John's saying, hey, I thought you were the one who was going to accomplish the return from exile, right? If you remember back, we looked at the quotation from Isaiah 40 in Matthew chapter 3 about John the Baptist and all these themes of return from exile. And so I think John's sort of asking here, Jesus, if you're accomplishing the return from exile, why am I in prison, right? I was a faithful prophet who announced your coming. We're on the same team here, Jesus. So why is it that I'm in prison? That, I think, at least the way I read this passage, is sort of the subtext of John's question of like, hey, if you're the one, I thought maybe I'd be by your side. I thought maybe you would have brought the kingdom by now. I thought maybe Israel would be independent by now. I thought maybe you would have achieved the return from exile. And instead, here I am sitting in prison, right? And so John's imprisonment and, of course, eventual beheading sort of hangs over this passage and hangs over this question that John is asking of Jesus. And I think I just want to pause here and say, I find this to be a really relatable question from John, right? I mean, don't we also look around our world and go, well, Jesus, like, if you're the one that we say you are, if you're the one that we thought you were, if you're the Messiah, the deliverer, the one who's supposed to accomplish this return from exile, why is all this stuff still happening, right? Like, it may not be that we're in prison, but a lot of people are in prison, right? Like, imprisonment a lot of people are imprisoned in the United States, right? Or we could point to any other whole host of issues, right? That there are all these ways in which our world does not work the way it's supposed to, and we might kind of ask the same question to John, like, are you the one who was to come, or should we look for another? Maybe we got it wrong. Maybe Jesus isn't the one, right? Well, I think Jesus' response is really interesting, right? Because Jesus could have responded to this question in a lot of ways. He could have been indignant, right? Like, oh, how dare you ask if I'm the one, or how dare you lose faith, or whatever. I mean, he'd say, oh, I'm going to come rescue from prison, and we are going to drive the Romans out, right? But Jesus' response here is really interesting in verses 4 through 6. He echoes the words of Isaiah 35. So Jesus responded in verse 4, go report to John what you hear and see. Those who were blind are able to see. Those who were crippled are walking. People with skin diseases are cleansed. Those who were deaf now hear. Those who were dead are raised up. The poor have good news proclaimed to them. Happy are those who don't stumble and fall because of me. The cynic in me might say or might imagine John responding to this like, okay, Jesus, great, like, terrific, glad the blind can see and the crippled can walk, but I'm still in prison, right? But I think Jesus' response here actually says something really profound, and you can see I've put the words of Isaiah 35 over here on the side, because Jesus is echoing that language, right? Isaiah 35 says, "Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf will be cleared, the lame will leap like the deer, and the tongue of the speechless will sing." So you can see the similarities with what Jesus is saying. And this passage in Isaiah 35 is another one of these sort of prophetic promises of the work that God is going to do. In fact, if you go and read the first few verses of Isaiah 35, you'll see that it is even this kind of new creation language, right? Like this, almost this image of like God is renewing the creation and making things new. And this opening of the eyes of the blind and clearing the ears of the deaf and allowing the lame to leap, like those are all sort of signs of this new creation, right? It's signs of the new thing that God is doing, the way that God is renewing the world. And so I think that's actually really significant, because I think what Jesus' response to John's disciples here is essentially saying is, John's asking, are you the one who is going to renew the creation or not? Because I'm not so sure, because I'm sitting here in prison. And Jesus is saying, yes, look, the words of Isaiah 35 are being fulfilled. And maybe some of the subtext here is, I get that it's not being fulfilled the way you expected, right? I understand that you would have thought you wouldn't have been in prison when this was being fulfilled. But look, the words of Isaiah 35, the acts of new creation are in fact happening in Jesus' ministry. And so I think there's a message here of, no, it's not what you expected, but uh, but the new creation is taking root in my ministry. And I think that actually helps us to understand what may seem at first glance, at least, a kind of an odd saying of what Jesus says here in verse 6. Happy are those who don't stumble and fall because of me. This Greek word that's translated as don't stumble is actually the word in Greek scandalizo, and you can hear in that our English word scandal, right? So Jesus is essentially saying, happy are those who are not scandalized by me. That's Jesus's response to John, essentially. Like, don't be scandalized by the fact that the new creation that you yourself predicted in my ministry, don't be scandalized by the fact that it doesn't look the way you expected. It is in fact taking root. And really in the verses that follow, Jesus goes on to really affirm John, right? It says when John's disciples had gone, Jesus spoke to the crowds about John. So he now turns to the crowds and he really affirms the ministry of John. Just because John has this question about Jesus, he doesn't sort of negate John's ministry. He doesn't say that he was wrong. He says to the crowd, what did you go out to the wilderness to see? A stalk blowing in the wind? What did you go out to see? A man dressed up in refined clothes? You remember how John's clothing was described back in chapter 3. It is not refined, right? Leather belt, camel's hair. He's eating locusts and wild honey, right? Look, those who wear refined clothes are in royal palaces. What did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, Jesus says, I tell you, and more than a prophet. So he's saying, yes, John was a prophet. John had it right. Even though he's asking this question now, what he had to say before was correct. And so then we have this callback to chapter 3, to the very passage that we heard last week, where he says, he is the one of whom it is written, look, I'm sending my messenger before you who will prepare your way before you. So again, we have that reference to Isaiah 40, which we just saw back in chapter 3 last week. So we have that callback to John preparing the way for an alternative path to peace, or pointing to Jesus really as preparing a way for an alternative path to peace that we talked about in the passage last week. And really, you even see some resonance between the passage here in Isaiah 35 and what Actually, let me circle that a little bit differently because that's hard to see with that blue on blue. Um, that just like in Isaiah 40, the passage we heard last week, that we talked about the highway being made in the desert, right? And that was the path of peace. That was the path for the return from exile, the highway between Babylon and Jerusalem, so that people could return home. Well, look at this here in verse 8 of Isaiah 35. Again, you have a highway will be there. It will be called the Holy Way. The unclean won't travel on it, but it will be for those walking on that way. And this is right there with that language of the eyes of the blind being opened, the deaf being made to hear, that new creation language in the beginning of Isaiah 35. So really, there's just a lot of intertwining between what we heard last week in Matthew 3, what we're hearing this week in Matthew 11, and also these themes in Isaiah 35, and also the themes in Isaiah 40. They all kind of overlap back together, and Jesus calls our attention back to that right here when he reminds us of that passage in Isaiah 40. And he goes on to say, I assure you that no one who has ever been born is greater than John the Baptist, yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Which is a little bit of a cryptic saying, right? But I think the sense here, at least the way that I understand this, is that this is a way that Jesus is saying how radically new what he's doing is, right? There's the sense of like John is the last of the great prophets, right? He is the one who pointed to Jesus himself and the new work that God is doing in Jesus. And yet the new thing that God is doing in Jesus, this return from exile, this new creation, is so radically new that it's it's so radically new that even as great as John was, as great of a prophet as he was, that doesn't compare to even the least of what Jesus is doing, right? Um, so overall, I think this is actually just a really compelling message. I mean, I think there's so much to work with here in preaching and teaching from this passage, precisely because what I mentioned before, that I think John's question is so authentic in the sense that it's one that we all ask too, right? And it's so so appropriate for the season of Advent as well, when we're in the season of waiting on the coming of the kingdom, waiting on the manifestation of Jesus' ministry, waiting for justice and peace to come to our world. And we also might very well look around like John and say, Jesus, did we get this wrong? Are you not really the one? Because if you were, I would have thought you would have done something about all of this stuff that's wrong with our world by now, right? And I think the sort of big picture here is that Jesus invites us to find joy by noting where the kingdom is blossoming even in the midst of our adversity, right? So the theme for this third week of Advent is joy. And maybe you've noticed a kind of pattern at this point that has come up in each of these gospel passages in these first 3 weeks of Advent. Um, the first week the theme was hope, but the text was about the flood, right, and judgment. And you kind of go, well, where's the hope in all the judgment, right? But there was a hope in the judgment because the judgment is part of God's way of setting the world right. And then I think last week, the theme was peace, but we heard John the Baptist saying things like, you brood of vipers, right? Who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? And you might kind of at first glance go, well, like, where's the peace in that? And yet we saw that there was a path to peace in it, right? Because even though John is issuing this warning, he's also pointing to Jesus as this alternative path to peace, this return from exile, right? So in each of these weeks, there's this sort of, I don't know if you want to call it irony or just complexity, but again, in this week, right, it's like the theme for the third week of Advent is joy, and we start off with a story of John the Baptist being in prison, right? You go, well, where's the joy in that? But that's exactly what Jesus' response points us to, is that the joy is not found in the circumstance of him being in prison or out of prison, but that the joy comes from seeing that, yes, actually, the kingdom of God is indeed taking root in Jesus' ministry through all the things that Jesus is doing, even as John remains in prison. And so I think each of these passages really challenges us to think about these themes of hope and peace and joy in much deeper ways, right? That they are not simply connected to things going well, because sort of in each of these passages, there are ways in which things are not going very well, but that in fact hope is a choice when things aren't going well. That peace is something that we're called to lean into and live into even when things aren't going well. And that joy and contentment are about more than our circumstances, right? That we're called to find this joy by having our own eyes open, right? Talk about the eyes of the blind being open and the ears of the deaf being unstopped, that we need our own eyes and ears and minds and hearts opened so that we can see the ways in which God's kingdom is taking root in our world, even in the midst of imprisonment, right? Even in the midst of all the things that are going wrong. And so I think in many ways our prayer for this third week of Advent can be, God, open our eyes, unstop our ears, so that we can see and hear the ways that you are at work in the world, the ways that your kingdom is taking root, and that we can find genuine joy in seeing that kingdom take root, even as we look around our world and see all the adversity that fills it.